If you had told me 6 years ago that I'd one day become the backbone of Palmer International's Atlanta office, I probably would have laughed and changed the subject. Back then, I was just grateful to have landed a solid operations role after my divorce, hoping that the steady hours and dependable salary would offer the kind of stability I'd always wanted. But as time passed, I became more than just a cog in the machine. I learned the rhythms of the company, when budgets needed tightening, when client relationships had to be massaged, when the coffee machine was on its last legs, and someone needed to make a quick run to Kroger to keep the team from rioting. I learned everyone's secrets, too. That was just how it was in our office. If something needed to be done, it found its way to me. Palmer International's Atlanta branch wasn't what you'd call flashy. Our building, an uninspired block of glass and brick tucked into a busy section of Peachtree Street, sat between a worn-out pizza joint and a bank that always seemed to be closing early. Our lobby was furnished with generic art and low, humming lights, but once you made it past reception, you'd find a small army of professionals dedicated to keeping a very complicated business afloat. We specialized in logistics and business development for American and European tech companies. Our contracts stretched from the high rises of Manhattan to warehouses on the outskirts of San Francisco. My title was Senior Operations Coordinator, but on most days, I felt more like a firefighter, a therapist, and an amateur diplomat rolled into one. Every morning, I arrived by 7, before the city's traffic had a chance to turn the roads into a parking lot. I'd make myself a mug of weak coffee, skim the news, and then dive into emails, hundreds of them, it always seemed. Some were urgent, others were from suppliers in California about late shipments, or a client in London who'd somehow misplaced an invoice, again. But I liked it. I liked being the person people turned to when things were on fire. I liked knowing the inside story on every contract, every personality in the office, and every secret handshake deal. I suppose, looking back, I liked feeling indispensable. I also liked the people I worked with. There was Olivia in HR, always quick with a sarcastic joke, and Jerry, our old-school finance manager, who had worked at the company since the Clinton administration. Then there was Amanda in compliance, who never missed a single regulatory detail, and Marcus, our marketing lead, who would bring in fresh bagels every Friday. I even liked Richard Palmer, the company's founder and CEO. He was stern but fair. A relic from another era, and he made it a point to know everyone's name. For 5 years, the status quo held, and I felt secure in my place. Until the morning Peter Palmer arrived. It was an ordinary Monday when the elevator doors opened and out strode the boss's son. Peter Palmer was, in every sense, the kind of man you'd expect to see stepping out of a glossy magazine, tall, with perfectly coiffed hair and tailored suits that looked custom-made. Later, I'd learn they were, each suit costing more than I spent on my monthly mortgage. Peter had just graduated from a business school in Europe, and he wasted no time making sure everyone knew it. He carried himself with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, walking past reception with the casual air of someone who'd never been told no in his life. My first impression? I'll be honest, I didn't like him. There was something about the way he barely glanced at the rest of us as he entered, just a flash of white teeth and the briefest of nods, as if he were acknowledging the staff at a country club, not meeting his new team. He swept through the office, shaking hands with the executive team but skipping right over the support staff, the people who made the company run. And then he was gone, ducking into his father's office and closing the door behind him. We'd all known, in vague terms, that the boss's son was coming. Richard had mentioned Peter in a few meetings, always with a hint of pride, and hinted that fresh blood was what the company needed to expand internationally. But I don't think anyone, including Richard himself, expected Peter to start making demands on his very first day. The first meeting I had with Peter was in the conference room, just past 9 o'clock. He breezed in with a tablet in hand, sat at the head of the table, and started scrolling through the week's reports. He didn't bother with introductions. Instead, he looked up at me and said, "I need you to reassign the Worthington Bank account to my friend, Luke Adams. He'll be joining us tomorrow." I blinked. Worthington was our biggest client, a pillar of our revenue, and every detail of their business was a delicate dance of compliance regulations and legal minutiae. Luke Adams? I had never heard the name before. I hesitated, carefully choosing my words. "Peter, the Worthington account is complicated. I've been managing it for 3 years, and there are a lot of moving parts." He cut me off with a wave of his hand. "Luke went to Cambridge with me. He'll figure it out. Just make sure the files are on his desk by 10. I glanced across the table, looking for support. None came. Olivia stared at her notebook, Jerry was fidgeting with his pen, and even Marcus avoided my gaze. I realized, in that moment, I was alone. Still, I stood my ground. "If we don't handle The handoff correctly, it could put us in violation of several contractual agreements, I said. And if anything goes wrong with Worthington, we could lose hundreds of thousands of dollars in revenue. My voice was steady, but my heart was pounding. Peter's reply was as cold as it was swift. If you can't follow a direct order from your manager, maybe you should reconsider your future with this company. He didn't shout, didn't raise his voice, just stared at me as if daring me to challenge him again. The meeting ended just as quickly as it had started. As I returned to my small office, a space I had made my own with photos of my sisters in Boston and my adopted cat, Minnie, I felt the sting of humiliation, mixed with a rising sense of anger. Who was this kid to threaten me? I had spent years earning the trust of Worthington and every other client who kept Palmer International afloat. I knew the contracts, the compliance protocols, the risks, and the realities. Peter had never even attended a single negotiation call. That day, as I watched him strut around the office, dropping orders and dismissing people who disagreed, I realized I was going to have to protect myself. I didn't have powerful connections or a fancy degree, but I did have experience, and I knew how to cover my tracks. So I started documenting everything, every reckless demand, every threat, every backdoor deal. I created a private file on my laptop at home, backing up every email and copying every memo that seemed questionable. I saved voicemails, printed meeting notes, and, after a while, even started keeping a journal of the daily chaos. If Peter Palmer wanted a war, then I was going to give him one, but I'd do it by the book. I'd survive, not by fighting fire with fire, but by shining a light on every corner he tried to keep in the dark. What I didn't know then was that my stubborn refusal to give in would set off a chain of events that would change everything, for Palmer International, for Peter and his father, and me. But on that first Monday, all I knew was that my job, and maybe my entire career, was suddenly at risk. I would need all my wits, my allies, and every ounce of resilience I had. As the sun set over Peachtree Street, I made myself a promise: I would not be bullied out of the work I loved. If the Palmer men wanted to play games, they would soon discover that I had learned how to win them. Looking back, those first few months after Peter Palmer's arrival were the hardest of my entire career. It felt as though everything I'd worked for, all the trust and steady progress we'd built at Palmer International, was being unraveled right before my eyes. If Chapter 1 was about shock, Chapter 2 was about survival. Peter wasted no time making himself known. He seemed to believe that leadership was a matter of volume and bravado, strutting through the halls with his expensive suits and louder opinions. He'd walk into meetings late, announce sweeping changes with no warning, and then disappear to play golf with his friends from business school. No sooner had he arrived than he started slashing budgets. Departments found their operating funds halved overnight. Travel approvals, which I used to handle carefully, became a matter of whim. Peter once approved a $10,000 flight to New York for himself and his so-called strategy consultant, but then denied a $350 training expense for one of our analysts. He made wild promises to clients, mostly European fintech companies and a handful of American logistics firms, offering delivery times, new services, and custom pricing models he'd just invented that morning. I'd sit in on these calls and feel my stomach drop. Sometimes I'd try to quietly correct him or offer more realistic timelines, but he would either cut me off or brush past me with a look of annoyance. Worse, he never once apologized when his plans failed. He just blamed someone else. The effect on the office was immediate. People who had been with Palmer International for years started handing in their resignations. Olivia King, our HR manager and my closest friend at the company, was the first to go. One Friday afternoon, she came to my desk looking tired and older than I'd ever seen her. "I got an offer from Morgan & Howe in Chicago," she said quietly, "and I think I need to take it." I hugged her tightly, fighting back tears, and wished her well. But inside, I was scared. If Olivia was leaving, something was wrong. After that, the departures came in waves. 3 of our best analysts, the ones who'd helped me land the Worthington bank account, left within a month. I watched Marcus from marketing pack his things, followed a week later by Danielle from procurement. Each time someone left, Peter would send out a cheery all-staff email about embracing change and fresh perspectives, but those of us who remained knew what was happening. The core of Palmer International was cracking with every exit. My workload doubled. I covered compliance reports, drafted invoices, trained new hires, and managed accounts I'd never even seen before. But I refused to bend. Peter might have had the Palmer name and a fancy degree, but I had something he didn't: the loyalty and respect of the people still left, the ones who remembered what it was like to work as a team. I became their confidant and shield, the person they came to when they were too afraid to speak up. It wasn't glamorous, most days, I barely had time for lunch, but it gave me a purpose. Behind closed doors, Peter was even worse. He started calling me insubordinate for questioning his instructions. There was the time he tried to force me to sign off on a $250,000 wire transfer to a vendor called Westbridge Consulting, a name I'd never heard before. He insisted he'd personally vetted the vendor. When I asked for documentation, standard protocol, he rolled his eyes and said, "Why can't you just do what you're told for once?" I calmly explained that, as operations coordinator, I couldn't approve payments without proper verification. That was when he lost it. "Maybe it's time you think about whether you belong here," he said, in that cold, clipped tone I'd grown to dread. He even tried to have me fired, going to his father with a litany of complaints about my attitude and failure to execute. Luckily, Richard Palmer still remembered all the years I'd kept his company afloat. He called me into his office, told me he'd heard the concerns, and then, in his gruff way, urged me to just work with Peter, if you can. I left his office knowing I was on my own. Every night, I went home to my little house in Decatur, exhausted. I'd microwave something bland for dinner, sit at my kitchen table, and pore over the growing mountain of files and notes I'd gathered. Each time Peter barked out a reckless order or sent a threatening message, I documented it. Every suspect payment, every questionable email, every attempt at intimidation, if it crossed my desk, it was saved. I kept everything on a secure drive, one only I could access from home. Part of me felt a little paranoid, but I knew I was doing the right thing. I had learned the hard way that the best defense was a paper trail. It wasn't long before I realized I wasn't the only one who saw through Peter's charade. Amanda, our compliance officer, was as sharp as ever. She caught on quickly that something was off, especially when her department's audit requests went mysteriously unanswered, or when Peter started bypassing established procedures. One evening, after most people had left, Amanda stopped by my desk. "Can I talk to you?" she whispered, glancing around to make sure we were alone. We sat in the break room, sharing stale coffee and a sense of frustration. "Have you noticed how payments are being approved without oversight?" she asked. I nodded, feeling a wave of relief. I wasn't imagining things. "And did you see the paperwork on that new vendor? Westbridge Consulting?" I told her everything I knew. By the end of our conversation, we both understood that something much bigger was happening. Rachel from legal joined us next. She'd been quiet in meetings, but I'd always suspected she was observing everything. She started sending me little notes, carefully worded, asking for copies of certain emails or contracts. We began meeting after hours, in Amanda's office. Or sometimes at the bakery down the street, comparing timelines and compiling a list of questionable decisions. Our evidence grew every week. There were mismanaged funds, attempted firings, angry emails from clients, and, perhaps most suspicious of all, a deal Peter had struck with a London-based partner that seemed to exist only on paper. The address was nothing more than a mailbox, and the invoices looked like they'd been whipped up in Microsoft Word that morning. The more we discovered, the more anxious I became. Still, Peter pressed on, utterly convinced no one could touch him. He'd wander the halls, loudly proclaiming new plans, promising investors that international expansion was just months away, and pushing his cronies into key roles. He seemed to believe that the company, and everyone in it, existed only to serve his ambitions. Rules, contracts, and basic decency meant nothing to him, but those of us in the trenches weren't about to let Palmer International sink without a fight. We built our coalition slowly, sharing only with those we trusted. We encouraged the staff who remained to document everything and to come to us if they felt threatened or uncomfortable. Amanda trained her team to flag suspicious transactions, and Rachel made sure legal records were airtight. For every wild decision Peter tried to force through, we had a record ready to counter it. Of course, there were moments I wanted to quit. More than once, after another exhausting day or after reading a new tirade from Peter, I found myself staring at my computer screen, thinking about walking away. But I remembered what it felt like when the company ran well, when we celebrated together after landing a new contract or solved a tough problem as a team. I knew I owed it to myself, and to everyone still holding on, to fight for that kind of workplace again. Sometimes, late at night, I'd sit in my backyard, looking up at the Atlanta sky, wondering how much longer I could keep going. I felt the weight of every decision, every person who had left, every threat Peter had made. But then I'd remember Amanda's steady determination and Rachel's quiet brilliance, and I knew I wasn't alone. Together, we were building a case, not just for ourselves, but for the future of Palmer International. Battle lines had been drawn. Peter thought he was untouchable, that the Palmer name would shield him from any consequence. What he didn't know, and what gave me strength on the hardest days, was that the real power in any company isn't held by those who shout the loudest or spend the most money. It's held by the people who care enough to do the right thing, no matter the cost. And so, as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, we kept our heads down and our eyes open. The struggle was far from over, but for the first time, I believed we might win. It was almost surreal how fast things began to unravel, but looking back, I know it wasn't luck. It was the slow, careful work that Amanda, Rachel, and I had done for months, the hours spent collecting evidence, the late-night meetings, the whispered conversations in the hallway, and the relentless commitment to keeping Palmer International from slipping off the edge. Still, even with all our preparation, nothing could have prepared me for the storm that was about to hit. The spark, fittingly, was Worthington Bank. Worthington had always been more than just our biggest client, they were a pillar of Palmer International's reputation. We'd built their trust over the years, carefully meeting their compliance standards, navigating their endless legal requirements, and delivering steady, reliable results. Every quarter, when the numbers came in and our Atlanta office posted another win, I felt a quiet pride. That partnership was the gold standard for us, and I'd been the main contact since my second year with the company, but Peter had never understood that relationships mattered. To him, Worthington was a target, a trophy he could flash in front of investors. He had no patience for the slow, careful work that made that account successful. Instead, he tried to innovate, pitching them new services he dreamed up after one too many drinks with his strategy consultant. He sent emails with lists of proposed upgrades, none of which had been vetted by legal or compliance. He promised them speed, discounts, and integrations that our systems couldn't deliver. And, worst of all, he made commitments without ever consulting the people responsible for making them happen. It didn't take long for Worthington to notice. At first, the emails trickled in, questions about changes to their reporting, confusion over billing, a polite request for clarification. I did my best to triage the fallout, looping in Amanda when the compliance questions got tricky and Rachel when the legal risks appeared. But Peter kept pushing, convinced that he could win them over by sheer force of personality. When they politely declined one of his offers, he tried again, this time CCing the CEO, Richard Palmer, as if that would intimidate them into submission. Then came the breaking point. I arrived at the office one Tuesday to find a flagged message from Worthington's legal department. They were, in their lawyerly way, furious. They listed half a dozen violations of their contract and threatened to terminate the relationship if we did not immediately resolve the issues. Buried in the email was a single, devastating sentence: if Palmer International cannot uphold our agreement, we will be forced to seek services elsewhere. I felt my stomach drop as I read it, knowing just how catastrophic losing Worthington would be, not just for me or the Atlanta office, but for the entire company. The fallout was immediate. Richard Palmer summoned me and Peter to his office, slamming the door behind us. His face was red, his jaw tight. He read out sections of the Worthington contract, word for word, his voice shaking with barely contained anger. Peter, for the first time since he arrived, looked genuinely nervous. "I trusted you to handle this," Richard said, glaring at his son. "Do you understand what's at stake here? Worthington is nearly 20% of our annual revenue. If they walk, the board will want someone's head," Peter sputtered, trying to shift the blame. "The team wasn't keeping up. I was trying to deliver more value," Richard cut him off. "You ignored every procedure, every warning, every piece of advice. This is not how we do business." He turned to me. "What would you do if you were in my position?" I looked Richard in the eye and told him the truth. If we want to save the Worthington account, and our reputation, someone needs to take responsibility. We need to make things right, immediately, and show them that Palmer International still has integrity. That meeting ended with no resolution, just a sense that the air was running out of the room. Peter stalked off to his office, slamming the door, while Richard stared out the window, lost in thought. For the first time, I saw real doubt in the old man's eyes. He was torn between loyalty to his company and his family, and it was clear the two could not coexist much longer. That afternoon, Amanda, Rachel, and I met in the conference room. We all knew the time had come. "This is our chance," Amanda said quietly. "We can't let him destroy everything we've built." Rachel, always meticulous, slid a folder across the table. Inside was a thick stack of printouts, emails, memos, wire transfer requests, client complaints, and audit logs. At the front was a timeline, showing exactly how Peter's actions had cascaded into crisis. "We have to take this to the board," I said, the words heavy in my mouth. "If we don't act now, there won't be anything left to save." We spent the next 2 days working late into the night, piecing together the story. Amanda compiled a compliance summary, highlighting every violation of policy, every risk that had been ignored. Rachel drafted a legal analysis, showing how Peter's reckless decisions had exposed us to lawsuits and regulatory fines. I put together the financial impact, how much money Peter's mistakes had already cost us, and how much more we stood to lose if things didn't change. We even secured a sworn statement from a former VP in New York, who Peter had tried to bribe into looking the other way during an earlier fiasco. He described, in detail, how Peter had offered him a bonus in pounds, 50,000, to be exact, to fudge the numbers on a quarterly report. By Friday morning, our binder was 3 inches thick, tabbed, and indexed. We booked a slot on the board's agenda for the end of the day, a move that raised eyebrows, since the board rarely met with operations staff directly. As I walked into the meeting, clutching the binder, my heart was racing. I had never gone up against the company's top brass before, but I knew I had no choice. The room was silent as we took our seats. The board members, some flown in from New York, others from Boston and London, looked tired, their faces drawn. Richard Palmer was at the head of the table, flanked by his son, who sat rigid and pale. I caught Amanda's eye and felt her steady presence. Rachel nodded once, calm as ever. Rachel spoke first, her voice clear and unwavering. She laid out the facts, the contractual breaches, the missed deadlines, the client complaints. She explained how Peter had bypassed legal and compliance, ignored warnings, and endangered our biggest account. Amanda followed, presenting the compliance failures and the risks we now faced: fines, audits, possibly even legal action if Worthington made good on their threats. Then it was my turn. I stood and opened the binder, flipping to the financial section. I read out the numbers, my voice louder than I expected. Peter's actions have already cost us nearly $3 million in lost revenue, penalties, and emergency payouts to keep clients from walking. If Worthington leaves, we stand to lose an additional $7 million in annual business. This isn't just about one client. This is about the future of Palmer International. When I finished, the room was silent. I saw the board members exchange glances, their faces grim. No one said a word for a full minute, the tension hanging in the air like a storm about to break. Finally, Eleanor Price, the chairwoman from Boston, cleared her throat. "We appreciate your candor," she said. "We will discuss the next steps in private." I left the room feeling numb, the adrenaline still coursing through me. I knew we had done everything we could. All that remained was to wait. By Monday morning, the decision was out. Peter was removed from all managerial duties, pending review. And Richard Palmer was placed on administrative leave for failing to intervene. The announcement was terse, sent via company-wide email, but its impact was electric. For the first time in months, the office felt lighter. People whispered in the hallways, relief mixed with disbelief. There was still work to be done, but for the first time, I believed that change was truly possible. In that moment, I realized something powerful: real leadership isn't about having the loudest voice, the fanciest title, or the family name on the door. It's about the courage to do what's right, even when it means risking everything. And for Palmer International, the turning point had finally come. 3 weeks after the board's dramatic decision, I was summoned to the executive suite on the top floor. I barely had time to wonder why before I was led into the sunlit corner office of Eleanor Price, the board chairwoman. Eleanor was a woman whose presence filled a room without effort. She had flown down from Boston and looked every inch the authority figure in her navy suit and understated jewelry. There were no pleasantries, no small talk, she simply gestured. "For me to sit." "You held this company together," she said, her voice measured, as if she were pronouncing a final verdict. "Palmer International needs someone who can set a new course, and more importantly, someone the staff will trust. We want you to lead the international division, effective immediately. The role comes with a $40,000 raise and an equity stake." I sat there for a moment, stunned. My mind flashed back to my earliest days in Atlanta, when I used to stay late just to make sure invoices were filed properly, and I would daydream about the possibility of a corner office. Now, it was being offered to me not as a fantasy, but as recognition. I could feel my breath catch in my chest. I smiled and said, "Thank you, Eleanor. I accept." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. The atmosphere at Palmer International shifted in ways I could hardly have imagined just a month before. The sense of constant dread that had haunted the halls evaporated, replaced by tentative optimism. I started my new role by calling a company-wide meeting, not in the glass conference room that had become a symbol of Peter's rule, but in our casual downstairs kitchen, the heart of the company. People filled every seat, some standing along the walls, all eyes on me. For the first time in months, I saw hope on their faces. I spoke honestly about what had happened and what needed to change. I acknowledged the pain and uncertainty we'd all endured. "We can't rebuild this company by pretending nothing happened," I said. "We're going to restore trust, insist on transparency, and remember that our values are what set us apart." I promised that accountability would be more than just a buzzword. Everyone, including myself, would be held to the same standard. My first order of business was to rebuild the leadership team. I called Olivia King in Chicago the next morning. She answered on the second ring, her voice cautious. Is this a social call, or? I want you back, Olivia, I said. I need you. The company needs you. Name your salary. There was a long pause, and then a burst of laughter. You always did know how to make a girl feel wanted, she said. She was back in Atlanta by the following week, her energy and wit infusing the office with new life. With Olivia at the helm of HR again, people finally felt safe coming forward with ideas and grievances, knowing they would be heard. I promoted Amanda to Director of Compliance and gave her the resources and staff she had always deserved. She set about overhauling every process Peter had disregarded, instituting new checks, regular training, and a policy of full transparency for all international accounts. Rachel became General Counsel, her careful eye ensuring we would never again be blindsided by risky decisions. The three of us met every Monday morning, a standing tradition that soon became the company's true compass. One of my proudest moves was reaching out to people who had left under Peter's regime. I called Marcus in New York and Danielle in Denver, offering them their old jobs back, this time with real authority and a clear mandate for integrity. Some returned, some didn't, but word spread quickly. Palmer International was turning a new page. Meanwhile, Peter and his father slipped quietly out of company life. Richard retired to his estate in Connecticut, and Peter took a sabbatical to focus on personal development, as the official memo put it. They were not fired publicly, but neither were they invited to the Christmas party or featured in the annual report. Their absence, rather than their removal, became the new normal. Staff no longer walked on eggshells, and the gossip about the Palmers faded, replaced by conversations about the future. With the toxic influence gone, morale surged. I saw it in the little things, the laughter in the hallways, the way people volunteered for new projects, and the steady stream of ideas landing on my desk. For the first time in years, staff meetings ended with applause, not silence. Our clients noticed, too. Worthington Bank renewed its contract, sending a glowing letter of thanks. New business began to flow in from companies in London, Paris, and even Berlin, all drawn by our reputation for honesty and reliability. When I traveled to meet clients abroad, I was welcomed not as a replacement for the Palmers, but as the leader who had set things right. Still, there were challenges. The months of chaos had left gaps in our finances and cracks in our reputation. Amanda worked tirelessly to reassure regulators, while Rachel negotiated settlements with two former clients who had threatened lawsuits. Olivia revamped hiring and onboarding, determined to create a culture that valued initiative but rejected entitlement. I spent late nights in my office, often alone, poring over spreadsheets and drafting policies. There were setbacks, delayed contracts, difficult negotiations, moments when I doubted myself. But each time, I remembered how close we had come to losing everything, and I pushed forward. I made it a point to be accessible. I invited junior staff to lunch, hosted informal roundtables, and listened more than I spoke. I wanted everyone, from the receptionist to the board, to feel heard. I encouraged teams to bring me bad news early and praised those who flagged problems instead of hiding them. Slowly, trust was rebuilt, one conversation at a time. One of the most meaningful days came 6 months after my promotion. We hosted an all-staff event at a local park, a real celebration, not just a corporate photo op. As I watched people play softball and eat barbecue, I felt the kind of warmth that can't be faked. I looked around at the people who had survived the storm with me, Amanda laughing with Rachel under the trees, Olivia corralling a group of interns, Marcus telling stories by the grill. My house in Decatur felt more like home than ever. The burdens of the past had finally begun to lift. Travel became a regular part of my life, but it never felt burdensome. I went to London to sign a partnership with a British tech firm, stood under the Eiffel Tower in Paris with our new European director, and took meetings in New York with investors who had once been wary. Each trip reminded me how far I had come, not just as a professional, but as a person. I was no longer the woman who kept her head down and took orders. I was the one setting the standard, laying the groundwork for the next generation. The year ended on a high note. Profits rebounded, employee turnover dropped to an all-time low, and our client satisfaction scores topped 95%. But what mattered most to me was the respect I'd earned, the handshakes, the thank yous, the quiet looks of trust from colleagues who had seen the company's worst and chosen to believe in its best. On the last day before Christmas break, I stayed late in the office. The city lights glowed beyond my window, and the only sounds were the hum of the heater and the distant laughter of my team finishing their work. I thought of the binder of evidence that had started it all, now locked away in a file cabinet, and the quiet resolve it had taken to bring the truth into the open. I knew there would always be challenges ahead, but I also knew I would never face them alone. Standing up for what was right, against all odds, had saved Palmer International. In the end, it had given me something I never expected, not just A career, but a sense of purpose, belonging, and respect that would last far beyond any title or paycheck. As I turned off the lights and stepped out into the cool Atlanta night, I knew the story of this company was just beginning. And this time? It would be written by all of us, together.